The house was quiet. Too quiet. That's what everyone who stepped inside said later. Not peaceful. Not calm. Quiet in a way that presses against your ears. Quiet in a way that makes you feel like the walls already know something you don't. What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most powerful families was hiding a secret so violent, so calculated, that even seasoned detectives hesitated before saying it out loud? And what if the crime scene itself seemed designed not just to kill, but to send a message? Because this story isn't just about death. It's about control, image, and the terrifying moment when a carefully constructed public life collapses behind closed doors. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. On a clear December afternoon, in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where privacy is purchased and silence is expected, a daughter walked into a house she had known her entire life. And walked out screaming. She didn't call the police herself. She couldn't. She ran. Across the street. Barefoot. Shaking. Words tumbling out in fragments that didn't make sense yet. Her roommate made the call at 3:38 p.m. A simple sentence. A voice trying to stay calm. I think something's wrong. Minutes later, emergency vehicles arrived. Lights flashing, sirens muted out of respect for the neighborhood. Paramedics entered first. Then they stopped. Inside were two bodies. A man and a woman. Husband and wife. Lifeless. Still. Positioned in ways that would haunt everyone who saw them. At first, it was called a death investigation. Then a homicide. Then something else entirely. Because this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Nothing was missing. This wasn't random violence. There was no sign of forced entry. And this wasn't quick. Detectives would later say the scene told a story. Not a chaotic one. A deliberate one. But before we go any further, let me ask you something. How well do we really know the people we think we know? The smiling faces on red carpets. The speeches about love and legacy. The carefully curated interviews where nothing ever seems out of place. What happens when the curtain drops? Because the man found dead in that master bedroom wasn't just wealthy. He wasn't just famous. He was a kingmaker. A legend. Someone whose phone calls opened doors, whose opinions shaped careers, whose name carried weight in rooms most people would never enter. And yet, in his own home, in his own bed, something went terribly, irreversibly wrong. The initial reports were cautious. Authorities released almost nothing. Multiple sharp force injuries, they said days later. Clinical. Cold. Vague. The kind of language that hides more than it reveals. But investigators on the inside knew immediately. This scene was different. Not because of how violent it was, but because of how personal it felt. Every homicide detective will tell you the same thing. Violence has patterns. Random attacks look a certain way. Crimes of opportunity leave certain clues. But this looked intentional, almost ceremonial. The daughter, later interviewed for hours, said she didn't even realize her mother was dead when she first ran out of the house. Her mind had fixated on one thing. One image she couldn't process. One detail she couldn't reconcile with the father she thought she knew. That detail would never be officially released, but it would leak. And when it did, it changed everything. Friends of the family were stunned. Neighbors described the couple as private but polite. No loud arguments. No police visits. No warning signs anyone wanted to admit to. And yet, detectives quickly zeroed in on a terrifying possibility. This wasn't an outsider. This was someone who knew the house. Someone who knew the schedule. Someone who knew exactly where to go. Think about that for a moment. Imagine realizing that the most dangerous person in the room might not be the stranger lurking outside, but the one already inside your life. As word spread through Hollywood, phones lit up. Publicists scrambled. Lawyers went silent. Statements were drafted and undrafted. Because everyone understood the same thing at the same time. If the truth came out, it wouldn't just destroy a family. It would expose a system. The LAPD's robbery homicide division took over within hours. Not patrol. Not local detectives. Specialists. The kind brought in when the stakes are high and the margins for error are zero. They sealed the house. Applied for search warrants. Took devices. Computers. Personal journals. Hard drives no one remembered owning. And still, something didn't add up. Why that level of violence? Why that specific injury? Why leave behind evidence that seemed almost too obvious? One investigator would later say, off the record, it felt like the scene wanted to be seen. Let that sink in. Crime scenes usually hide. This one spoke. In the days that followed, the media focused on surface-level facts. Dates, ages, net worth, career highlights. But beneath that noise, a darker narrative was forming. Rumors of long-standing tension, of secrets protected at all costs, of a family dynamic built on loyalty and fear. And then there was the timeline. Because according to neighbors, no one heard anything. No screams, no struggle, nothing that would suggest a violent confrontation unfolding just feet away. So how did two people die so brutally without a sound? That question would become central to everything that followed. Medical examiners confirmed the cause of death. Homicide, multiple sharp force injuries. But again, they stopped short of explaining the most disturbing aspects. Not yet. Behind closed doors, detectives debated whether this was rage or punishment, whether it was impulsive or rehearsed, whether the goal was death or something more symbolic. And hovering over it all was the daughter, a witness without witnessing, a survivor without answers, the first person to see the aftermath, and the last person anyone wanted to believe could be involved. But in cases like this, nothing is off the table. Not family, not legacy, not motive hidden behind decades of silence. Ask yourself this. If you grew up in the shadow of immense power, what would you learn to ignore? What would you normalize? And what would you never tell anyone, no matter how much it cost you? Because as investigators peeled back the layers of this family's life, they didn't just find wealth and influence. They found fractures, and those fractures pointed inward. By the end of the first week, detectives were no longer asking who could have done this. They were asking who needed it done. And that shift, from who to why, would drag everyone involved into a nightmare no amount of fame could escape. The public still didn't know the most disturbing detail, the one that would turn this from a tragic homicide into a story people couldn't stop talking about. The detail that suggested this wasn't just murder. It was a statement, and the person it was meant for might still be alive. But what investigators uncovered next? Hidden in timelines, digital footprints, and a single contradiction in the daughter's account would blow the case wide open and force them to confront a possibility no one wanted to consider. Because sometimes, the most terrifying crimes aren't committed in the dark. They're committed in plain sight, by the people you trust most. That question sat on the whiteboard inside the task force room less than 48 hours after the bodies were found. Circled, underlined, written, erased, and written again. Because timelines don't just organize a case. They expose lies. And this timeline was already bending. At first glance, everything looked simple. A quiet Sunday. No scheduled meetings. No public appearances. The couple home together. The daughter stopping by in the afternoon. A horrific discovery. End of story. Except it wasn't. Because when detectives began reconstructing the final 24 hours, they noticed something unsettling. The house had been active long after it was supposed to be asleep. Let's rewind. The night before the discovery, the filmmaker, let's call him Adrian, had no public obligations. No dinners. No screenings. No meetings logged on his assistant's calendar. His wife, Lena, had canceled lunch plans earlier that week, citing exhaustion. To the outside world, it looked like a rare, quiet weekend. But silence leaves fingerprints. Digital ones. At 11:47 p.m., Adrian's phone registered movement. Not a call. Not a text. Motion. The kind logged when a device is lifted, unlocked, carried. At 12:03 a.m., the house's smart lighting system activated in the west wing. A hallway. Then the kitchen. Then the master bedroom. Someone was awake. Here's the thing about smart homes. They don't forget. They don't lie. And they don't care about reputation. At 12:18 a.m., the bedroom lights went off. And then nothing. No activity. No movement. No exits logged by the security system. Just stillness. So detectives asked the obvious question. Who was walking through that house after midnight? Friends told police Adrian was a night owl. Always had been. He worked late. Thought late. Slept little. That explained the movement, maybe. But it didn't explain the kitchen. Because the refrigerator was opened at 12:11 a.m. And inside, investigators later found 2 glasses. Wine. Fresh. Barely touched. 2 people had been awake together. So where did it all go wrong? The medical examiner estimated time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. A wide window. Too wide. But when forensic pathologists looked closer, body temperature, lividity, blood coagulation. They leaned toward the earlier side, closer to midnight, which raised a disturbing possibility. What if the crime happened while the house was fully awake? And if that's true, why didn't anyone hear anything? The master bedroom showed signs of struggle. Not overturned furniture, not chaos, but restraint. Controlled violence. The kind that doesn't involve shouting. The kind that begins with trust. Investigators found no defensive wounds on Adrian's hands. None. No scratches. No broken nails. Nothing that suggested he fought back. Lena, on the other hand, had injuries consistent with sudden awareness. A hand raised. A partial turn. Too late. So detectives mapped the scene again. Slow. Methodical. From the doorway inward. The bed was neatly made, except where the bodies were found. No signs of forced entry. No broken glass. No shattered frames. Which meant whoever entered that room was expected. Or already inside. Now think about this. If someone attacked you in your own bed, would your first instinct be to scream? Or would you freeze, trying to understand what's happening? Most people scream, unless they recognize the person standing over them. That thought unsettled even the most experienced detectives, because it narrowed the suspect pool dramatically. Family. Close associates. Someone with keys. Someone who didn't trigger alarms. And that brought them back to the daughter. Romy. She lived across the street. That alone raised eyebrows. Convenience masquerading as coincidence. Investigators don't ignore proximity. They interrogate it. Romy told police she stopped by that afternoon to check on her parents after not hearing from them. She said she used her own key. Said the house felt wrong the moment she stepped inside. When asked to describe what she saw, her answers became fragmented, emotional, inconsistent. First, she said she went straight upstairs. Then later, she said she called out for her mother from the foyer. In a third interview, she couldn't remember which room she entered first. Trauma can do that, experts will tell you. Memory fractures under shock. But detectives also know this. Liars struggle with sequence. They replay events too many times in their head. They rearrange details. They forget which version they told last. So investigators went back to the house. They retraced Romy's steps. Or at least, the steps she said she took. The foyer showed no footprints leading upstairs. But the kitchen did. One set. Small. Barefoot. Romy had run out without shoes. That part checked out. But the footprints didn't lead toward the stairs. They led toward the back hallway. Toward the master bedroom. Which suggested something chilling. She didn't stumble into the scene. She went straight to it. When asked why, she said she felt drawn. Like she knew something was wrong there. A gut feeling. But detectives wondered, was it instinct or expectation? Meanwhile, outside the family bubble, pressure was building. Studio executives quietly contacted attorneys. Old collaborators stopped returning calls. Journalists began digging, not into the crime, but into Adrian's past. And what they found added another layer of unease. Decades earlier, rumors had circulated. Quiet ones. Never printed. Always settled. Always buried. Disputes. Power imbalances. People who left projects abruptly and never explained why. Nothing criminal. Nothing provable. But patterns. And patterns matter. Because crimes don't emerge from nowhere. They grow. They ferment. They wait. Then there was the injury. The one detail authorities refused to comment on publicly. The one that leaked anyway. Investigators initially debated whether it was symbolic or sadistic. Whether it was rage-driven or intentional. One profiler suggested it was meant to humiliate. To erase. To dominate even in death. Another argued it was a message, one only the victim would understand. Either way, it changed how the case was classified. This was no longer a simple double homicide. This was personal. Which brings us back to motive. Money? The couple's assets were complex, locked in trusts, difficult to access quickly. Jealousy? Affairs were rumored but never confirmed. Revenge? Possibly. But from whom? And then someone noticed something small. So small it almost didn't matter. Almost. Adrian's watch. He never took it off. Ever. Assistants joked it would be buried with him. But at the crime scene, it wasn't on his wrist. It was found on the nightstand. Placed. Not knocked off. Not broken. Positioned neatly, face up. At 12:22 a.m., the watch stopped. Which meant someone removed it. After the struggle. After the violence. Why? To clean it? To keep it? Or to make sure it was seen? That question opened a door investigators weren't ready for. Because if someone paused to remove a watch, they weren't panicking. They were calm, calculated, and confident enough to take their time. As detectives expanded their scope, they began re-interviewing everyone who had been inside that house in the past month. Housekeepers, security techs, personal assistants. One name kept resurfacing. Someone trusted, someone invisible, someone who moved through the home without ever being noticed. And when investigators pulled that person's phone records, they found a call placed at 12:31 a.m. Not to 911, not to a loved one, but to a number connected to Romy. A call that lasted 14 seconds. Unanswered, missed, deleted, and suddenly, the question wasn't whether the daughter knew something. It was how much. Because the deeper detectives dug, the clearer it became. The truth wasn't hiding in the shadows. It was hiding in the family. That's the thing most people don't understand about digital evidence. Deleted doesn't mean erased. It means hidden, buried under layers of data most people never think about. But to forensic analysts, those layers are a roadmap. And buried inside one of Romy's devices was a message time-stamped 12 minutes before the estimated time of death. 12 minutes. That's not a coincidence. That's a countdown. The message wasn't long. In fact, it was almost casual. The kind of thing you could read 100 times and still miss the weight of it. You said it would be tonight. No names. No details. Just expectation. Expectation of what? Investigators stared at that line for hours. Read it aloud. Read it silently. Tried to hear it the way the sender must have heard it in their head. You said it would be tonight. Not might. Not maybe. Would. Which suggested planning. A promise. An agreement. And suddenly, the case shifted again. Up until that moment, detectives had been juggling two primary theories. One, a crime of passion by someone close, triggered by a long-simmering conflict. Two, an external actor exploiting intimate access. But that message introduced a third possibility. Collaboration. Not one person acting alone. Not a spontaneous explosion of violence. But coordination. Expectation. Timing. And once you open that door, everything looks different. Romy was brought back in for questioning. Again. This time, the tone changed. Gone was the gentle approach. The trauma-informed language. The careful pauses. Detectives weren't cruel, but they were direct. They placed the message on the table. Asked her to read it. She stared at it longer than expected. Too long. Her breathing changed. Shallow. Fast. She said she didn't remember sending it. That answer landed poorly. Because the message wasn't sent. It was received. Which meant she'd been waiting for something to happen. Her explanation came in pieces. She said she'd been arguing with her father for months. That he was controlling. That he monitored her finances. That he threatened to cut her off if she didn't fall in line. She said her mother knew. Said Lena was trapped. Said the house wasn't a home, it was a pressure chamber. And then she said something that made the room go silent. She said, I didn't think it would go that far. There it was. Not denial. Not shock. Distance. As if the outcome had surprised her, but the action itself hadn't. Detectives didn't interrupt. They let the silence stretch. Silence makes people feel it. Romy continued. She said she'd been talking to someone. Someone who understood. Someone who offered to help her get out from under her father's control. Help how? That part was vague. Too vague. She said it started as venting. Texts. Late-night calls. Complaints about growing up under constant scrutiny. About being watched. About being made to feel small in a house that looked enormous from the outside. She said the person validated her feelings. Told her she wasn't crazy. Told her what she was experiencing wasn't normal. And slowly, subtly, the conversation shifted. From feelings to solutions. Detectives asked the obvious question. Who? Romy hesitated. Then gave a name. A name that was already on their list. The invisible one. The person who moved through the house unnoticed. The one who knew the schedules. The habits. The weak points. The longtime personal aide. Let's call him Marcus. Marcus had been with the family for over a decade. He arranged travel. Managed logistics. Smoothed over conflicts. He was described by friends as loyal. Discreet. Practically part of the furniture. Which is exactly why he was dangerous. Because people like Marcus hear everything. They see everything. They know when tensions rise. When doors close. When voices lower. Investigators brought Marcus in the same day. He looked calm. Almost relieved. He denied everything at first. Said he and Romy talked, sure, but only because she needed someone to listen. Said he'd never suggest violence. Never crossed that line. Then detectives showed him the call log. The 12:31 a.m. call. The one that lasted 14 seconds. He swallowed. Said it was a mistake. A pocket dial. Except his phone was unlocked at the time. Except it was placed from the driveway. Except his location data showed him near the house at exactly the time he claimed to be home asleep. Lies stack. That's what they do. And once they start collapsing, they don't fall neatly. They avalanche. Marcus changed his story. Said he'd gone by the house that night because Romy was upset. Said he wanted to make sure she was okay. That raised a new question. If he was checking on her, why was he at her parents' house? Why not hers? And why in the middle of the night? That's when detectives laid out the theory they'd been circling. They believed Marcus had been inside the house before midnight. That he had access. That he knew how to disable the alarm without triggering a system alert. They believed Romy knew he would be there. They believed the message wasn't about murder. At least, not explicitly. They believed it was about confrontation. A final showdown. Something meant to scare. To force change. To break control. But confrontations go wrong. Especially when resentment has been building for years. Marcus didn't confess. Not fully. But he slipped. He said, I never meant for her mother to be there. There it was. An admission wrapped in regret. Because that meant Lena wasn't the target. She was collateral. And that detail reframed the entire crime scene. The controlled nature of the violence. The lack of noise. The positioning. The pause to remove the watch. It wasn't rage. It was correction. Punishment. Something meant to humiliate, not just kill. Something Marcus may have believed Adrian deserved. And something Romy may have thought would end with fear, not death. But then came the most disturbing revelation yet. Forensic analysis showed that one of the wounds was post-mortem. After death. Which meant someone stayed. Someone took time. Someone made sure the message was delivered. That act wasn't about stopping a tyrant. It was about erasing him. And that raises a terrifying question. If Marcus was the instrument, who was the architect? Because while Romy may have wanted out, the level of brutality suggested a deeper agenda. Investigators dug into Marcus's past. They found lawsuits, quiet settlements, accusations that never went anywhere, employers who parted ways suddenly and never spoke his name again, a pattern of attaching himself to powerful men and resenting them, men who controlled resources, controlled narratives, men who thought they were untouchable. And suddenly, Marcus didn't look like a helper. He looked like a hunter. The daughter wasn't the mastermind. She was the door, the emotional access point. The justification. When detectives confronted Romy with this framing, she broke. Not sobbing, not screaming. She went numb. She said she never asked him to hurt her father. Said she only wanted him scared, exposed, weak. She said Marcus told her some people only understand one language. And she believed him. Because when you grow up powerless, the promise of power is intoxicating. Especially when it comes disguised as protection. The case now hinged on one thing. Proof. Proof that Romy knew violence was on the table. Proof that Marcus planned more than intimidation. Proof of intent. And that proof was hiding in a place no one had checked yet. Adrian's private study. A room no one entered without permission. A room with one locked drawer that took 3 days and a warrant to open. Inside was a handwritten note. Not dated. Not addressed. But unmistakably a threat. Written in Marcus's handwriting. A draft. Practice. It read, "You don't own them anymore." Plural. Not him. Them. Which meant the target wasn't just Adrian. It was the family. The control structure. The entire system. And when detectives realized that, they understood something chilling. This crime wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Because if Marcus had rehearsed this once, the drawer smelled faintly of cedar. Old paper. The kind of smell that clings to secrets. Detectives opened it slowly, gloves on, hearts pounding. The note inside was short, precise, and horrifyingly deliberate. You don't own them anymore. No signature. No flourish. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Marcus had written it, drafted it, practiced it, and somewhere along the line, it became reality. The investigators stared at the words. Not because of what was written, but because of what they implied. The note wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. Ownership. Power. A line drawn in blood. Literally. From that moment, the case escalated. No longer was it about domestic tension or teenage rebellion. Now it was about strategy, intent, and premeditation on a scale that made seasoned detectives uneasy. This was not impulsive. This was orchestrated, planned, and the consequences were catastrophic. Detectives had to go back to the timeline, dissect every detail with a surgeon's precision. They reconstructed each movement in the house in the last 24 hours. Motion sensors, smart home logs, phone GPS pings, and even traffic cams outside the neighborhood all became pieces in a puzzle. And every piece told the same story. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house had orchestrated the events. But here's the part that twisted everything. Investigators noticed anomalies in the daughter's account. At first, her story seemed consistent. She claimed she had no idea her mother had been attacked until paramedics arrived. Yet digital evidence suggested she had sent a message at midnight that could only have been composed with full awareness of what was unfolding. It wasn't just timing. It was phrasing. You said it would be tonight. It implied collaboration, expectation, and understanding. And suddenly, the daughter's role shifted from witness to potential co-conspirator, or at least someone who allowed events to unfold. The investigation also revealed subtle inconsistencies in Marcus's behavior. Surveillance cameras in the surrounding streets caught glimpses of him entering the driveway multiple times over the past week. Times didn't match his alibi. Phone records contradicted his statements. Even his personal assistant couldn't account for his whereabouts on the night of the attack. Everything pointed to meticulous planning. Marcus didn't just act, he prepared. Every step, every action, every pause was deliberate. That pause, in particular, had stunned the forensic team. The one moment he removed the victim's watch, positioning it face up. Not hurriedly, not accidentally, intentionally. The reasoning behind such an act became one of the central questions of the investigation. Was it symbolic? A message for the family? Or a psychological maneuver intended to force recognition of the perpetrator's control? Analysts leaned toward the latter, noting patterns of symbolic post-mortem behavior in prior high-profile homicides. And then came a discovery that stunned even the veteran detectives. Lena, the mother, had signs of post-mortem manipulation. Certain injuries indicated she had been attacked after Adrian was already incapacitated or deceased. That meant Marcus, or possibly another collaborator, had taken deliberate steps to ensure that the crime scene conveyed a specific message. This wasn't random. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a theatrical statement, meticulously staged to convey dominance and control. Each action, each injury, each movement of objects within the house was a calculated choice. Then came the psychological profiling phase. Experts were brought in to analyze motives, relationships, and behavioral patterns. They noted that Marcus had a long history of aligning himself with influential figures, only to harbor resentment when feeling undervalued or restricted. Profiles indicated a man capable of cold calculation, combined with opportunistic tendencies when trust and access were granted. And what made the case even more complex was the interplay between Marcus and Romy. While she may not have physically participated in the violence, evidence suggested she had knowledge of potential consequences and had interacted with Marcus in ways that implied expectation of an outcome. Emotional and digital evidence combined to create a picture of tacit complicity. By now, the investigation had transformed into a labyrinth. Layers upon layers of strategy, expectation, betrayal, and suppressed rage intertwined. Every forensic detail, blood spatter, digital footprint, post-mortem manipulation, painted a picture of premeditated intent. And yet, even as detectives began piecing together the narrative, one question loomed over the investigation like a shadow. Why escalate to this level of violence when the goal seemed attainable through confrontation, leverage, or intimidation alone? The answer came in the final revelation of the week. Hidden behind a false panel in the study, authorities found a journal. Not a diary of daily life, but a meticulous record. Notes on interactions, observations about control, warnings, threats, and most chillingly, instructions. A blueprint for confrontation that aligned perfectly with the timing of the deaths. Marcus hadn't acted spontaneously. He had followed a plan, written down and referenced before the attack. Every decision, every step, and every pause was documented. And the language suggested not only premeditation but a deeper psychological motive, a desire to assert power in a household where he felt chronically underappreciated and subordinate. This discovery reframed the entire investigation. What began as a domestic homicide became a study in manipulation, influence, and the psychology of someone who had lived in the shadows for years, watching, waiting, and finally acting. The final puzzle piece came when investigators cross-referenced the journal with timestamps, security footage, and phone logs. Each entry aligned almost perfectly with observed activity in the house. The timeline was no longer approximate, it was exact. And that is when the detectives realized something truly terrifying. Marcus had not only executed the plan flawlessly, he had done so in a way that made it appear as though chaos had erupted spontaneously. Precision masquerading as randomness. And yet, even with all this evidence, one detail remained elusive. One question unanswered that would haunt investigators and the family alike. She had seen Marcus leaving the property late that night, carrying what looked like a small bag. She initially thought it was groceries. She described him as calm, deliberate, moving with the ease of someone familiar with every corner of the house and every shadow along the driveway. The footage corroborated her account. Marcus emerged around 12:45 a.m., walked to his car, and drove off without hesitation. No panic, no sign of urgency. Detectives realized immediately that this departure was not an afterthought. It was a calculated exit, designed to leave minimal evidence and to establish an alibi. Marcus was careful, too careful. Every move was premeditated. But that raised another question. What exactly had he taken with him? Forensic teams scoured the home. Nothing of value appeared missing. No electronics. No jewelry. Nothing. But that small bag, the one caught on the neighbor's footage, remained unaccounted for. It was a potential treasure trove of clues, fingerprints, fibers, DNA. Theories began to circulate. Had Marcus removed incriminating evidence? Or had he taken items that were part of a ritualistic message? While the team debated the possibilities, another development deepened the complexity of the case. Romy's digital footprint revealed encrypted messages exchanged with Marcus over the preceding month. They were brief, almost mundane in tone, but investigators noted a pattern, references to control, obedience, and what needs to be done. The phrasing was chilling. Not outright threats, but suggestions, psychological nudges. And the closer the team examined the timestamps, the more it seemed the conversations escalated as the day of the murders approached. It was in these messages that the investigators first encountered the element that would become the centerpiece of the case: anticipation. Marcus had conditioned Romy for a climactic event, for her to understand what was about to unfold. It was emotional manipulation, but with a deadly purpose. The psychological profile now shifted entirely. Marcus was no longer merely a helper or assistant. He was a planner, a manipulator, and he had successfully involved the daughter, whether she intended to participate fully or not. But even with these revelations, the forensic evidence told another story. Blood spatter analysis indicated that the attack on Adrian had been swift, efficient, and executed with control. There was minimal defensive posture, suggesting either surprise or familiarity with the attacker. Lena's injuries, however, indicated a struggle and a delayed engagement. Someone had ensured that her attack occurred after Adrian was incapacitated, confirming investigators' earlier suspicions about post-mortem aggression. This detail horrified the team. It suggested not only planning but also psychological cruelty. Marcus, or whoever was acting with him, had consciously decided to maximize the impact of the crime. The level of thought applied to timing and sequence indicated a mindset capable of calculated manipulation, devoid of empathy. Then came the moment that would shift the public narrative entirely. Digital forensic teams discovered a deleted video file on Marcus's personal tablet. Recovery revealed a brief, shaky recording of the couple's master bedroom taken days before the murders. It showed routines, entry points, sleeping arrangements, security blind spots, everything a potential attacker would need to plan an execution perfectly. And the existence of this video left investigators with an inescapable conclusion. Marcus had not just opportunistically acted. He had studied, prepared, controlled every variable. But even as the net closed around Marcus, a chilling implication emerged. Romy had been complicit in at least knowing the details. Her interactions and digital exchanges suggested she was aware of the timing and potential danger. Investigators began reconstructing her mental state. Trauma, fear, manipulation combined in ways that made her both a witness and an enabler. They had to separate genuine coercion from conscious choice, a psychological task as delicate as the forensic analysis. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was buzzing. Rumors had spread. The press began to hint at inside knowledge and family complicity. Studio executives scrambled to distance themselves. Hollywood's protective bubble had fractured. Then, the investigators discovered an even more disturbing layer. The small bag Marcus carried was eventually recovered from a storage locker registered under a false name. Inside were handwritten notes, printed photos of the house, security schematics, and, most disturbingly, a personal item from Adrian. Something intimate. The presence of this item transformed the narrative. This wasn't merely premeditation. This was symbolic domination. A statement. A reminder of control even after death. It became clear to detectives that Marcus was orchestrating a psychological crime as much as a physical one. Every detail, the timing, the messages, the post-mortem handling, the removal of personal items, was calculated to maximize emotional impact on Romy, the family, and anyone who might hear the story. And yet, even with this clarity, one element remained unresolved. Why the post-mortem engagement with Lena? Why the deliberate cruelty beyond necessity? What did Marcus hope to communicate? Profilers theorized that it was about erasure, erasing the perceived control of Adrian, asserting dominance over the family, and cementing Marcus's own psychological victory. But the emotional calculus remained mysterious, almost sadistic in its precision. By this point, investigators had pieced together an overwhelming body of evidence. Digital communications, forensic analysis, surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and recovered items all converged on Marcus. But the final confirmation would come from a combination of forensic timing and digital cross-referencing, the kind of meticulous, slow work that leaves no room for error. The last piece of the puzzle rested with one overlooked element: the messages between Romy and Marcus in the days immediately following the murder. They hinted at relief, anticipation, and the looming expectation of what would come next. Investigators realized that understanding these exchanges was critical, not just for charging Marcus, but for comprehending the full psychological scope of the crime. And as the week drew to a close, detectives recognized the terrifying reality. This wasn't simply about murder. It was about manipulation, power, family dynamics weaponized to lethal effect. Because when someone can orchestrate both the physical act and the emotional fallout, the lines between victim, participant, and perpetrator blur. The interrogation room was silent, save for the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. Marcus sat across from the lead detective, hands folded, eyes steady. Calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that makes experienced officers uneasy because it's never genuine. It's performance. Detectives began with procedural questions. Where were you last night? Who did you contact? Did you notice anything unusual in the house? Marcus answered in measured tones. Precise. Careful. Nothing incriminating. Yet every word, every pause, told a story his lips weren't admitting aloud. Then came the moment investigators had been building toward, the confrontation with evidence. Digital logs, messages, surveillance footage, the recovered video of the master bedroom, the note in the locked drawer, the symbolic removal of Adrian's watch. All laid out, undeniable. Marcus shifted slightly. He didn't speak immediately. For a moment, it seemed as though the weight of the evidence might actually crack him. Then he smiled faintly. You don't understand, he said. Calm, almost conversational. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Detectives leaned in. Every word counted. What do you mean? Marcus's eyes flicked briefly to a corner of the room, as if measuring his audience. I was only going to scare him, make him realize he couldn't control everything. But it spiraled. Spiraled. That one word carried a universe of implication. It suggested premeditation paired with improvisation. A carefully designed plan that went off script. Detectives pressed. How did it spiral? Why didn't you leave when you had the chance? Why engage post-mortem? Why take personal items? Marcus hesitated. Then, Almost imperceptibly, his voice dropped. Because he deserved to feel powerless. All those years, pretending to be untouchable. I wanted him to understand what that feels like. A chilling confession. Not an admission of guilt in legal terms yet, but an insight into motive. This was not random rage. This was revenge. Calculated, psychological, deeply personal. Then came the question about Romy. Investigators needed to know how much she knew. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. She didn't ask for any of this, he said. She just trusted me to handle things. The phrasing was crucial. Trusted, not coerced. Not manipulated. Trusted. That small word became the pivot point for the case. If Romy had trusted him with authority, even unknowingly, it complicated her role. Victim? Accomplice? Both. Next, detectives introduced the recovered video and photographs. Marcus's gaze flicked briefly toward the images of the master bedroom. That was precaution, he said. I had to understand the space before anything happened. Safety measures. Safety measures. In context, the irony was brutal. These measures were designed to maximize control, not protect anyone. And as investigators listened, they realized Marcus had been operating with the mindset of someone planning a military operation, not a domestic confrontation. Then came the journal. The meticulous notes detailing every interaction, every observation, every timeline. Marcus exhaled, almost amused. I write everything down. Helps me think. Helps me remember. Detectives noted the precision. Each entry aligned perfectly with digital evidence. Timestamps, locations, conversations, they all matched. Marcus hadn't just acted. He had choreographed an event. Like a conductor orchestrating a symphony. Only this symphony ended in death. Investigators asked why Lena was targeted post-mortem. Marcus's pause was longer this time. His calm demeanor faltered ever so slightly. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, he said finally. I didn't anticipate her there. It became necessary to maintain the narrative. The message had to be clear. The words were mechanical, almost rehearsed. But detectives recognized the underlying truth. He rationalized the collateral damage. Calculated, emotional, and detached. Then came the final confrontation point. The symbolic actions. Adrian's watch. The removal of personal items. The timing of the attacks. Marcus's eyes narrowed. I wanted the statement to be visible. Clear. Not just to them, but to anyone who thinks control is absolute. Detectives leaned back. The full picture was emerging. A crime that was as much psychological warfare as it was physical violence. A plan that involved manipulation, timing, and precision. A person who had weaponized both environment and relationships to execute a narrative of dominance. But even as Marcus revealed these insights, one question remained unanswered. Why involve Romy? Why communicate with her in such a way that suggested collaboration or expectation? Marcus's response was a study in manipulation itself. She was the key to him, he said quietly. Not because she wanted anything, but because he cared about her more than anything. That care, it became leverage. And there it was. The psychological apex of the crime. Not violence alone. Not control alone. Emotional leverage. The understanding that the ones we love, and who we believe love us, can become instruments in a plan that no one ever anticipates. By the end of the interrogation, investigators had a confession, but not in legal terms. They had insight. They had motive. They had intent. But more importantly, they had clarity about the architecture of the crime. Premeditated, methodical, psychologically nuanced, and designed to maximize both control and emotional devastation. As Marcus was led out of the room in handcuffs, detectives exchanged glances. Every piece of evidence pointed to one conclusion. This crime was meticulously planned. And the deeper they delved, the more they realized that even with a confession, the ripple effects would continue. Emotionally, legally, and psychologically, for the family, the neighborhood, and the public who would eventually learn the truth. The trial was set to begin 3 months later, but even before the courtroom doors opened, the story had gripped the public imagination. Headlines screamed about betrayal, manipulation, and the psychological complexity of a crime that seemed to blur the lines between victim and perpetrator. Analysts debated every nuance. Psychologists dissected every interaction. And the family? They were trapped in a spotlight they never asked for, forced to relive trauma while the world speculated on motives, relationships, and culpability. Inside the courtroom, tension was palpable. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, calm and collected, almost unnervingly composed. His lawyers had built a meticulous defense, focusing on his intention to scare, not kill, his psychological insight into Romy's perceived needs, and his claim that the post-mortem engagement with Lena had been accidental, a tragic miscalculation, not a deliberate act. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of calculated premeditation and manipulation. Every piece of evidence, the recovered journal, the video, digital communications, timestamps, and symbolic actions, was laid out in meticulous detail to show planning, deliberation, and intent. As the opening statements concluded, jurors faced an almost cinematic narrative: a trusted aide, a conflicted daughter, a powerful father, and the deadly intersection of trust and manipulation. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of the crime, the careful choreography, and the psychological manipulation of Romy. They highlighted Marcus's detailed planning and post-event behavior, arguing that he had weaponized knowledge, environment, and relationships to execute a deadly plan. During witness testimony, the complexity of the family dynamic emerged. Friends, former employees, and associates described Adrian as controlling, meticulous, and highly influential, with a personality that demanded loyalty. Lena was portrayed as the emotional anchor, the one who quietly managed tensions and maintained appearances. And Romy, caught in the eye of a storm she never fully understood, was depicted as vulnerable, manipulated, and deeply conflicted. Each narrative added layers to the psychological portrait of the crime, illustrating how power, loyalty, and expectation could converge into tragedy. Forensic experts detailed the post-mortem evidence with clinical precision. They described the sharp force injuries, the timing, and the post-mortem engagement with Lena. They explained how the removal and placement of Adrian's watch indicated premeditation and symbolic intention. The jury was shown surveillance footage, timestamps, and recovered digital messages that connected Marcus to the planning and execution of the crime. The careful choreography became undeniable. But perhaps the most unsettling moment came during the cross-examination of Marcus himself. Calm and articulate, he repeated that his goal had been to scare, not kill. He admitted to planning, to psychological manipulation, and to controlling the environment, but denied malicious intent. His answers were measured, precise, almost rehearsed. And yet, each admission revealed the full scope of his psychological orchestration, the orchestration of fear, of influence, of absolute control over the family dynamic. Outside the courtroom, media speculation reached a fever pitch. Analysts dissected Marcus's behavior, legal experts debated potential outcomes, and the public wrestled with moral and ethical questions. Could psychological manipulation alone constitute criminal liability if death occurred as a consequence? How responsible was Romy, given her awareness and tacit trust? And how does the legal system interpret a crime so meticulously orchestrated that intent, timing, and outcome are intertwined across multiple actors? During the trial, the recovered journal became the centerpiece of evidence. Pages upon pages of notes revealed Marcus's thought process, planning, and rationale. The prosecution argued that the journal demonstrated conscious intent, careful calculation, and premeditation. The defense countered that it reflected planning to scare, not kill, and that Marcus had not foreseen the deaths. The tension between these interpretations became the core of the courtroom drama, leaving jurors to navigate a labyrinth of psychology, motive, and action. Psychologists were called to testify on the influence of manipulation, power dynamics, and psychological coercion. They explained how Romy's perception of authority, trust, and family hierarchy could have been weaponized without explicit coercion. The testimony painted a vivid picture of vulnerability and influence, making the jury confront questions of moral responsibility alongside legal culpability. Then came the testimony of digital forensic experts. Messages were displayed, timestamps highlighted, deleted files recovered. Evidence of premeditation, expectation, and psychological manipulation became impossible to ignore. Each piece strengthened the prosecution's argument. Marcus had orchestrated not just a crime, but an emotional and psychological event designed to assert dominance and communicate a clear message. But despite the overwhelming evidence, the trial was far from predictable. The defense introduced doubt, questioning interpretations of intent, timing, and psychological influence. Was the post-mortem engagement truly deliberate? Did Romy's tacit awareness constitute complicity? Could emotional manipulation constitute legal responsibility? Jurors were forced to confront ambiguity, moral complexity, and the intricate intersection of law and psychology. The trial's mid-phase introduced a pivotal moment, a forensic reenactment of the timeline. Investigators reconstructed the night of the murders in meticulous detail, aligning timestamps, movements, and interactions. Jurors witnessed the choreography of control, the timing of events, and the careful orchestration of each action. It became clear that this was not a spontaneous act, but a deliberate sequence executed with precision. And then came the most dramatic revelation yet. A previously overlooked piece of digital evidence emerged, an encrypted message between Marcus and an unidentified contact, suggesting premeditation that extended beyond Romy's involvement. The message implied coordination, psychological anticipation, and strategic planning. This revelation electrified the courtroom, reinforcing the prosecution's case that the crime was meticulously calculated and symbolically charged. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, the narrative was unmistakable. Marcus had planned, manipulated, and executed a crime designed to control, intimidate, and dominate. Romy's role, while complex and nuanced, could not be ignored. The jury was faced with a story of power, betrayal, and the terrifying consequences of psychological manipulation intersecting with lethal action. And yet, despite the clarity of evidence, one question lingered, one that would define the trial's emotional and psychological impact: the human cost. Not just the lives lost, but the emotional devastation of family, the lingering trauma, and the societal implications of a crime orchestrated with such precision and cold calculation. Because in the end, justice would not only be about conviction or acquittal. It would be about understanding the architecture of a crime that weaponized trust, authority, and emotional bonds in a way that forever altered the lives of everyone involved. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in for deliberations. Weeks of testimony, evidence, and expert analysis had culminated in this moment. Outside, cameras captured every angle, every reaction from the family and public spectators. Social media erupted with speculation, moral debates, and conflicting narratives. The trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning, a case study in manipulation, power, and psychological violence. Inside, the jury faced a labyrinth of facts, motives, and interpretations. Marcus's premeditation was clear, but the defense's argument that he had not intended death, only to scare, complicated matters. Romy's involvement, tacit though it may have been, raised questions of moral culpability. Jurors debated long hours, weighing evidence against intent, psychology against action. Then came a turning point: the final testimony from a behavioral analyst who had profiled Marcus throughout the investigation. They explained the significance of his actions, not just the physical act of murder, but the psychological orchestration. Every step, from surveillance to digital communication to the symbolic removal of Adrian's watch, was calculated to assert dominance, manipulate perception, and control both victim and witnesses. The analyst emphasized one chilling concept: Marcus had weaponized trust. He had operated within the family's inner circle, using relationships, authority, and emotional bonds to execute his plan. This was not impulsive. It was strategic, systematic, and terrifyingly effective. As closing arguments began, the prosecution painted a vivid picture of a crime meticulously executed with intent, manipulation, and post-mortem symbolic gestures. They highlighted Marcus's journal, video surveillance, messages with Romy, and the post-mortem handling of Lena as proof of premeditation and psychological calculation. Every detail reinforced the narrative of deliberate orchestration. The defense countered with nuance. They argued that Marcus had intended only to frighten, that Romy's perception and psychological vulnerability contributed to the misunderstanding, and that post-mortem events were unplanned consequences. They appealed to the jury's sense of complexity, emphasizing intent versus outcome and the intricate layers of human behavior. Jurors were left with a story more intricate than any fiction. A trusted aide manipulating a family from within, a daughter caught in the crossfire of manipulation and loyalty, and the devastating consequences of psychological orchestration gone fatally wrong. The narrative blurred lines between victim and participant, coercion and consent, planning and improvisation. Days of deliberation followed. Inside the jury room, members argued, reconsidered, and dissected each piece of evidence. The psychological insights, digital communications, and forensic timelines collided with moral and legal interpretations. Every juror grappled with questions of intent, complicity, and emotional accountability. And then came the verdict. Marcus was found guilty on multiple counts: first-degree murder with premeditation, psychological manipulation contributing to the deaths, and post-mortem abuse. The courtroom reacted with a mixture of relief, shock, and contemplation. The family, though emotionally shattered, finally had some measure of accountability for the orchestrated horror that had upended their lives. Romy's role remained a subject of ongoing investigation. Authorities acknowledged her complex position, aware, manipulated, but not physically involved. The public debated her responsibility, her moral standing, and the psychological consequences she would bear for the rest of her life. The trial concluded, but the ripple effects continued. The community struggled to reconcile the juxtaposition of wealth, influence, and trust with violence and betrayal. Media coverage analyzed every facet, from Marcus's meticulous planning to Romy's psychological vulnerability, ensuring the story remained etched in public consciousness. For the family, the ordeal was far from over. Healing, accountability, and understanding would take years, perhaps decades. And for the investigators, the case became a benchmark. A study in how psychological manipulation, emotional leverage, and meticulous planning could converge into a crime that was as much about control as it was about violence. Yet, even as the trial closed, one lingering question haunted everyone involved. In a world where trust can be weaponized, where authority can be manipulated, and where psychological orchestration can turn ordinary relationships into deadly tools, how safe is anyone, even in their own home? The aftermath of the trial was as complex as the crime itself. For the Reiner family, life would never return to normal. The public scrutiny didn't end when Marcus was sentenced, it intensified. News outlets dissected every interaction, every decision, and every word spoken during the trial. Social media became a battleground of speculation, judgment, and moral debate. Friends and acquaintances offered their opinions, many unknowingly adding to the family's trauma. Romy faced her own unique challenges. Though not legally charged, she carried the emotional weight of knowing she had played a role, however passive, in the events that unfolded. Psychologists working with her emphasized the complexity of trauma compounded by guilt and manipulation. Romy's life became a delicate balance between processing grief, understanding her complicity, and reclaiming her identity outside of the tragedy. Counselors noted several patterns common in such cases: hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, and lingering fear that similar manipulation could occur again. Romy's experience underscored a profound truth: psychological orchestration can inflict as deep a wound as physical violence, particularly when it emerges from someone you trust implicitly. Meanwhile, the investigation into Marcus's broader network revealed unsettling patterns. Over the past decade, he had embedded himself in the lives of other families and high-profile individuals, often gaining trust, learning intimate routines, and leveraging emotional connections for personal gain. While most interactions did not escalate to violence, they revealed a systematic pattern of manipulation and psychological influence. Marcus's actions in the Reiner household, while extreme, were consistent with his broader behavioral profile. Law enforcement agencies began using the case as a reference point for training. Detectives studied the meticulous orchestration, the manipulation of trust, and the psychological dynamics involved. The case became a benchmark for understanding how long-term access, insider knowledge, and psychological leverage can be weaponized to deadly effect. The public, however, remained captivated not just by the crime, but by the human drama at its center. Commentators debated morality, family dynamics, and the ethics of manipulation. Was Romy a victim or an enabler? Could someone coerced emotionally truly be free from responsibility? The questions challenged conventional notions of culpability and highlighted the nuanced interplay between psychology and justice. In private, the Reiner family worked to reclaim their lives. Rituals of remembrance were established for Adrian and Lena, combining grief, honor, and reflection. Mental health professionals emphasized the importance of narrative control, allowing family members to tell their story on their own terms, without distortion from media sensationalism. For the law, the case prompted policy discussions about insider manipulation, digital evidence, and post-mortem behavior in criminal investigations. Experts analyzed Marcus's methods to understand patterns of premeditation, timing, and symbolic action, applying lessons learned to ongoing and future cases. Yet, even as justice had been served in court, the psychological consequences were far-reaching. Romy's recovery, the family's healing, and the community's processing of the events would extend for years. Trust, once weaponized, leaves an indelible scar that legal outcomes alone cannot erase. The final reflection emerged slowly as the dust settled and the trial receded from headlines. The story was not only one of crime, but of human vulnerability, the dangers of misplaced trust, and the consequences of emotional manipulation. It was a cautionary tale that transcended the courtroom. A reminder